Since Jordan Peterson's return from rehab for tranquilizer addiction in Russia and Serbia, the number of interviews he's done with Joe Rogan is 0. This is odd because Peterson's back from the brink chats have typically been with friends, some of whom practically worship him as some kind of deity. Who knew that a divine being could hail from Alberta, pair cowboy boots with occultic garb, and admit in a book which he says is chiefly about the Holocaust that he lusted after his cousin Diane from Saskatchewan? Anyhow, 2 adoring and uncritical friends who have been granted the privilege of FaceTime are Douglas Murray, whose fixation with non-white immigrants in Europe and Black Lives Matter suggests an incurable neurosis, and Dave Rubin, who has thrown bouquets at the alt-right, explaining that although he is not for white supremacy or neo-Nazism, the alt-right as a shit-posting, call-out-the-bullshit, mock-the-power thing is amazing. There's nothing funny coming out on the left anymore. They're a bunch of preachy little bitches. Ah yes, Rubin is not for the alt-right's neo-Nazism. He felt it necessary to say that. But he is for the comedic shitposting. I wonder if he had in mind Nazi-themed posts like this one. Or this one. Or this one. Or perhaps these ones. Or maybe this one. Hey look, Peterson also does funny alt-right posting. And here he is doing it again. What a comedian. Carrying on, Joe Rogan has been a different kind of friend to Jordan Peterson. Most notably, he's not an alt-right crank. He rarely floats conspiracy theories that suggest we're being controlled by communist politicians or liberal elites. He almost never makes nasty comments about women. I have never heard him say anything racist. Indeed, he seems to really dislike racism, and he doesn't seem interested in cheering on social inequality or exploitation. In Peterson's small circle of strange, callous, and bigoted friends, Rogan has been something of an outlier. However, he has also been highly impressionable. Although he has challenged Peterson, he has swallowed a lot of the psychologist's neo-fascist pablum. For instance, when Peterson mischaracterized universities as Marxist training camps that only produced graduating classes of extremists and safe space-loving cream puffs, Rogan offered little resistance. Ditto when Peterson cried foul about Canada's compelled speech laws. Peterson informed Rogan that these draconian measures had come into effect, saying Canadians were already compelled to use prescribed speech, as were Americans, especially New Yorkers, although people didn't know it yet. A little fact-checking would have revealed that neither statement was true. In light of Peterson's claims, Canadian legal scholars and the Bar Association felt the need to reassure the public that tabling regulations compelling speech was impossible. No human rights groups weighed in on the matter because there was nothing to weigh in on. Indeed, the only Canadians accusing the government of thought control appeared to be Peterson and his fans. Mind you, many of those fans were non-Canadian. For instance, Joe Rogan, who informed one of his guests that Canadians were, legally obligated to use 78 gender pronouns. He said this was because Canada does not have free speech. They do not have the First Amendment. It's true that Canada doesn't have the First Amendment. Canada doesn't have any amendments. But it does have a really good women's curling team. Peterson's forced speech claim was a publicity stunt, a hysterical lie meant to attract the gullible and the paranoid. I understand that Americans are largely unfamiliar with or indifferent to what happens in Canada, and fair enough. But compelled speech in New York, and without any of the 19.5 million residents of that state realizing it? This was Rogan's opportunity to call Peterson's bluff. But he didn't, and, as mentioned, he went on to reformulate Peterson's lie. And this is what has helped make him an ideal conduit for Peterson's crypto-fascist messaging. Joe Rogan has given Jordan Peterson access to millions of listeners, mostly white, male, and working class. What a coincidence. That's Peterson's demographic. As Peterson told Rogan, rough working class guys, that'd be about 30% of my audience. Peterson has also spoken to Rogan about hockey and basketball. Discerning listeners might have wondered why. Peterson has no interest in or understanding of sports. However, he does have an interest in making listeners think that, deep down, he's just a regular guy. Such rhetorical stratagems are also meant to soften up the audience. You see, Peterson follows a formula. Seemingly benign subjects, personal anecdotes, and life advice often precede alt-right dog whistles and unusual remarks about National Socialism. With Rogan, Peterson has talked about the marvels of Wayne Gretzky during the heyday of the Edmonton Oilers, the benefits of an all-meat diet, and has warned of the evils of postmodernism and Canada's small L liberal government, in addition to making defensive, ambiguous, or flattering statements about Adolf Hitler and Wilhelm Trapp, the commander of Reserve Police Battalion 101 of Hitler's Order Police. Peterson likes to emphasize that the Order Police were just regular police, tasked with maintaining order in a time of war. Although they were the regular police during the Weimar Republic, after the Nazis grabbed power in 1933, they were militarized and came under the purview of the SS. 23 battalions were formed, with the aim of achieving Lebensraum and exterminating the Jews. Some battalions were attached to the Wehrmacht or the Einsatzgruppen. They were called police to mask their true intentions. When Peterson talks about them as though they were US state troopers or Canada's RCMP, he is also masking their true intentions. Concerning Wilhelm Trapp, Peterson told Rogan that Trapp was humane because he informed his battalion that they could go home if they didn't think they were up to it, so there was no compulsion. This wasn't a Milgram experiment or an experiment where you had to obey orders. Peterson characterized Trapp's working-class men as decent guys. He failed to mention that those decent guys murdered 83,000 defenseless Jews, men, women, and children. As for Trapp, their humane commander, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and was executed. Peterson was not issuing a warning to steer clear of fascism. On the contrary, by depicting a Nazi death squad as a group of decent guys, he was signaling to his rough working-class guys. He does this all the time. If most guys don't pick up the signals, fine. Peterson knows that some will. As for the others, they might be receptive to the idea of signing up for Mikhaila Peterson's Lion Diet, and for just one easy installment of $600. Peterson never really speaks to the host. Instead, he uses the host to communicate with people who would think that non-existent forced speech laws have migrated from Canada to America, or who would understand what Peterson meant when he depicted Nazi war criminals as decent and humane. Peterson sent out more neo-Nazi signals on the Joe Rogan Experience when he scoffed at people who compared him to Hitler. People shouldn't draw such parallels, he said, because Hitler was among the panoply of satanically possessed leaders. Note how panoply sounds a bit like pantheon, and be aware that Peterson has referred to Hitler as God the Father, a quasi-deity, and has said, in a laudatory fashion, that hordes of people worshipped him. When Peterson protested that he wasn't worthy of being compared to Hitler, he was, need it be said, lavishing Hitler with praise. But again, Rogan failed to intercept the message. When it comes to Peterson, he always does. Even when Peterson has practically admitted to Rogan that he's a neo-Nazi, Joe has been absent, a howling void, an empty space. Peterson to Rogan. Jung believes that the pathway to completion is through the, embodiment of the monster. That's the discovery of the shadow. So, Jung didn't believe that you could be a good person until you realized your capacity for evil. Some people are only good. They're like a domesticated house cat. They don't even have the capacity to be bad. So, there's no morality in that. The morality comes when you're a monster. If you start to understand who you are, then you understand the Nazis. And who wants to understand the Nazis? I can understand sex criminals. I can understand them. Right. I can understand Nazis. And the reason for that is because I can see that as an aspect of myself. Truly. I don't know what Rogan was thinking when Peterson was saying this, but I know what I was thinking. This guy is out of his gourd. As usual, Peterson was directing his message not to Rogan, but to other people who are out of their gourds, which is to say, current and prospective cult followers. And whenever Rogan fails to say, "What are you talking about?" that's a signal to Peterson that he can continue making such remarks. Concerning Peterson's reference to the Jungian shadow, even this was related to Nazism. Peterson has said to his students that Jung believed Hitler embodied the shadow of the German people. And here we have a rare instance of Peterson telling the truth. Jung said, Hitler represented the shadow, the inferior part of everybody's personality. Jung also said, in Hitler, every German should have seen his own shadow, his own worst danger. And Peterson encourages his rough working-class followers to embrace that worst danger. Peterson also told his students, Jung said that the human shadow has roots that reach all the way to hell. Jung actually said the Antichrist would correspond to the shadow of the self, namely the dark half of the human totality. Once more, we see Jung and Peterson associating the shadow with that which is satanic. You will understand the implications. Peterson was encouraging his students to become satanic, or like Hitler, who he said was satanically possessed. Jung believed that Hitler was satanically possessed. As Peterson has conceded, few of his ideas are his own. He appropriates them from others at the behest of a voice with eyes that appeared in his mind in his early 20s after he descended into schizophrenia. He documents his affliction in Maps of Meaning, the book in which he also talks about lusting after his cousin, relays a dream about his grandmother's pubic hair, says he visited a maximum security penitentiary where he discovered that he was just like the inmates, and practically admits multiple times that he is, and I quote, insane. While petitioning Joe about the evils of the Canadian government, who refused to integrate the Jungian shadow, choosing instead to offer additional legal protection to vulnerable groups to prevent discrimination and reduce hate crime, Peterson said that he would not comply with Canada's left-wing compelled speech laws because censorship was the first step on the path back to Auschwitz. He then dovetailed into an admission that he would have been a guard at Auschwitz, explaining that it was easy to envision himself taking someone who just got off the transport train and have them carry a 100-pound sack of wet salt from one side of the compound to the other. People don't like to picture themselves doing that because it's too frightening, but I know perfectly well that I could do that sort of thing, and maybe I could even enjoy it. And in the book, Mengele, The Complete Story, about Dr. Joseph Mengele, the SS officer who gladly sent around 400,000 people to the gas chambers and crematoria, an eyewitness at Auschwitz recounts. Day after day, Mengele was at his post at the railhead, watching the pitiful crowd of men, women, and children go struggling past, all in the last stages of exhaustion from the inhuman journey in the cattle trucks. He would point with his cane to each person and direct them with one word, right to be worked to death, or left to be gassed. He seemed to enjoy this grisly task. Dr. Mengele seemed to enjoy it. Dr. Peterson could enjoy it. Peterson routinely and manically describes himself as having what it takes to have worked at Auschwitz as a Nazi guard. He does so while employing phrasing and word choice which are so similar to eyewitness accounts of Dr. Joseph Mengele that for it to be a coincidence would be highly unlikely. As Peterson writes in 12 Rules for Life, over the previous decades, I had read more than my share of dark books about the 20th century, focusing particularly on Nazi Germany. That Dr. Jordan Peterson has focused particularly on Dr. Joseph Mengele is obvious. Speaking of the Holocaust, who could forget the episode of the Joe Rogan Experience that featured Jordan Peterson and Bret Weinstein? When Rogan said he wanted to discuss Hitler, Peterson expressed reluctance, citing that he might say something stupid. However, after Weinstein proffered that Hitler's attempt to enlarge the Reich and eliminate the other could be understood from a biological perspective, but that his comprehension of biology and racial theory was harebrained, Peterson took umbrage. Peterson, I've studied Hitler a lot, and there's a bunch of things that you can't say about him. You can't say he was stupid. You can't say he was without artistic talent. You can't say that he was a poor organizer. You can't say that he wasn't charismatic. You can't say that he didn't do wonders for Germany's economy in the first part of his reign. And so, it's very necessary if you're dealing intelligently with a true monster that you give the devil his due. Weinstein, yeah, so I think the thing that I saw in your video was, your argument was when he was losing, instead of putting the genocide on pause and, Peterson, winning the war. Weinstein, and winning, that he ratcheted up the genocide. Peterson, yeah, I don't know if it'd really be, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say it was him who did that, although I think he had a hand in it. It does appear to me to be that's what happened. Please note how Peterson called Hitler a true monster, and think about how he told Rogan's audience that the pathway to completion is through the embodiment of the monster, and that morality comes when you're a monster. If you start to understand who you are, then you understand the Nazis. And who wants to understand the Nazis? Anyone? Anyone? Would any Joe Rogan subscribers like to understand the Nazis? I can teach you how to understand them on my media platforms. I'm a clinical psychologist, you know. In fact, I'm completely clinical. Weinstein's recollection of what Peterson said was accurate. Peterson told his students, "When Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or while you're losing, you could just accelerate the mayhem even though it's counterproductive." It's like, what did they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem. And in 12 Rules for Life, Peterson says that if you have strength of character, you also have the capacity for mayhem and destruction. So be sure to strengthen your character, lobsters. To his students, Peterson was playing the role of Monday morning quarterback. If the Nazis had only bolstered the war effort and kept the chaos at bay, they could have maintained order and killed more Jews. Let's revisit how he denied saying that Hitler chose to ratchet up the genocide. Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say it was him who did that, although I think he had a hand in it. It does appear to me to be that's what happened. It's not fair to Hitler to say that he escalated the genocide, even though Peterson said that Hitler and his minions picked to accelerate the mayhem. You see, if Peterson offers a bit of post-Holocaust advice, a little, here's what Hitler should have done, that's fair. But criticism from others, or in this case, the other, someone who's Jewish, is unfair. We need fairness, nay, social justice, says Peterson, never, except when talking about a true monster. You can't say this about the Fuhrer, and you can't say that. It's very necessary that you give the devil his due. Shameless plug, I'm the author of a book called The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. And it was from listening to the Joe Rogan Experience that I first began to wonder if Peterson was orally plagiarizing Hitler. For instance, Hitler said, "People degenerate into an unthinking herd, which could be reduced to total subjection." And Peterson said to Rogan, "We're more like herd animals. We're pack animals, beasts of burden." Hitler said, "We wish to elevate national health by protecting the mother and child. The race that fails to come through the test will simply die." And Peterson told Rogan, "A culture that doesn't hold the mother and child as sacred dies." Peterson's statement also resembles one from Heinrich Himmler, who said, "Every German mother of good blood shall be holy to us." Furthermore, the phrase mother and child, or Mutter und Kind, often appeared on Nazi propaganda posters, which Peterson teaches about at the University of Toronto. Here's one of his PowerPoint slides featuring 5 Nazi propaganda posters. And here's a Nazi propaganda poster that says, "Support the assistance program for mothers and children." Peterson also told Weinstein and Rogan that, as a gift, he gave his father a Kekistan flag, a far-right symbol modeled after a Nazi war ensign. The Kekistan flag was among the banners waved by insurrectionists at the US Capitol. When Rogan asked Peterson why he had given an imitation Nazi war ensign to his father, Peterson fought off a smile and replied, "Because he's been following what's happening to me online." Joe Rogan laughed. Dave Rubin was correct. There's no humor like this coming from the left. You'll recall that earlier I said Peterson used Rogan as a conduit for his crypto-fascism. Allow me to unpack an example from the Peterson-Weinstein interview. Peterson said, "There's God the Father, but the Father's dead. The Father was right 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and is still partly right, but he's dead. And so your moral duty is to rescue your dead father." This was an allusion to Hitler and the fatherland. 100 years ago would have been 1917, 2 years before Hitler began blaming the Central Powers' loss on the Jews. Peterson said, "Your moral duty is to rescue your dead father," and Hitler used the phrase, "their duty to their fatherland." Hence, Peterson was probably imitating Hitler's speech in a cryptic reference that virtually no one would understand. As mentioned, Peterson has called Hitler God the Father. He did so while showing his students this propaganda portrait named the Standard Bearer, exclaiming, "Hitler's the knight. He's the knight of nationalism. Well, that's God the Father too, you know." And as he told Weinstein and Rogan, "There's God the Father, but the Father's dead." Yes, he died on April 30th, 1945. He shot himself, in fact, to avoid being captured by the Red Army, members of which entered the Führerbunker on May the 2nd. Hitler railed against the communists for 28 years, and they collected his charred remains as a war trophy. Peterson has been railing against them for at least 25 years, falsely implying, as Hitler did, that universities are overflowing with Leninists. He has also said that Canada's phantom compelled speech laws were the result of a quote-unquote communist plot. This is intriguing because he has insinuated that Germany's swing toward fascism after World War I was due in part to a quote-unquote communist menace. I have never heard him use a phrase like Nazi menace. Joe Rogan has given Jordan Peterson carte blanche to praise, defend, and downplay the malevolence of Adolf Hitler, Wilhelm Trapp, and the genocidal order police. He has been oblivious to Peterson's oral plagiarization of Hitler and his crypto-fascism. He has been gullible to the point of reformulating Peterson's lies, and protective by irately coming to Peterson's defense. Jordan Peterson is a pathological victimizer who pretends to be the victim, and Rogan has been there to listen, console, and guard against condemnation. You can't say this about Peterson, and you can't say that. However, rumors on the internet suggest that the spell may be broken, that Rogan is no longer willing to speak to Peterson, or that Spotify, Rogan's new platform, may not want Peterson's name tarnishing their reputation. When Spotify bought Rogan's podcasts, they refused to publish interviews with people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones. And Peterson defended Alex Jones after he was banned from YouTube, Facebook, and Apple. But of course he did. Alex Jones promotes the white genocide conspiracy theory, which holds that elites are colluding with non-white immigrants to replace white people. Peterson said that Alex Jones shouldn't have been deplatformed, just after saying Lauren Southern shouldn't be deplatformed. Lauren Southern also promotes the white genocide conspiracy theory. In any event, Michaela Peterson, who claims to be running her father's business, there's big money in neo-Nazism, has tweeted that her father and Joe Rogan are waiting to do an episode in person, and Dad's not traveling yet. Whether this is true, who knows, but I would wager that Rogan has not given Peterson the old heave-ho, and that he will interview him again, not because of Michaela's tweet, but rather Joe's unknowingness. Joe Rogan has told other controversial guests, such as Milo Yiannopoulos, that they're full of it. And he seems to have developed an intense dislike for Dave Rubin, so I doubt he'll be on Rogan's show again. But with Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan is in over his head. Peterson jumps from topic to topic, sticks to specialized topics that he's familiar with and Rogan isn't, dominates the conversation, and lies so often that even interviewers who are knowledgeable and critically reflective usually believe something he says. And it's Rogan's lack of knowledge and critical thinking that's the crux of the problem. Rogan believes space aliens have visited Earth, perhaps landing in Nova Scotia, where they were forced by Maoists to memorize 78 gender pronouns. He thinks the moon landing was faked. He recommends a smorgasbord of psychedelics. And he theorizes that killer whales held a conference in which they voted to abstain from attacking humans after they observed a bomb being dropped from an airplane. He has also described a bit of Ultimate Fighting Challenge brutality, that is, a man he depicted as covered in blood, knocking out another man and then screaming, as so beautiful that it brought tears to his eyes. For fascism to replicate and spread, it requires a petri dish of beliefs that are asinine and fantastical. Nazism was facilitated by superstition, anti-scientific thinking, mythology, folk beliefs, occultism, and the idea that the strong must dominate the weak. Joe Rogan is probably still under Jordan Peterson's spell. Peterson has tricked Rogan into believing he's a free speech advocate who really cares about people and takes issue with the excesses of the left and the right. Rogan has bought into Peterson's nonsense about being apolitical and non-ideological, and focused on the altruistic goal of rescuing lost men from the clutches of the far right so that they may rescue their dead father. As Peterson said to Rogan one-on-one, "You rescue your father from the depths and you rise back to the surface with him. That's what our culture has to do. That's what our culture has to do." Instead of asking, "What do you mean?" or "Who is the dead father?" Rogan transitioned to the subject of religion. Unless Spotify really is mortified by Peterson, which doesn't seem to be the case, Peterson is on Spotify with his own podcast. It's likely that the all-new Joe Rogan experience will soon feature a recovering JP trying to elicit more sympathy from a legion of rough working-class guys, this time by discussing the difficulties of rehab, moaning about the staff at Penguin Random House Canada for calling him an icon of hate speech and white supremacy, and characterizing the Marvel Comics depiction of him as a Nazi supervillain as both amusing and indicative of the reprehensible left and their communist agenda. In 2019, Rogan said to Peterson, "Out of all the people that I'm friends with, you're probably the most misrepresented friend that I have." To be sure, Rogan has misrepresented Peterson for about 4 years, and I expect this to continue. Thank you for listening and watching, and if you liked this video, feel free to share.